If you're excited that the UFC is back, then be sure to show it by smashing the like button.
And new interim UFC lightweight champion, Justin the Highlight Gaethje.
Welcome back everybody to Keenan K TV. To understand what happened at UFC 249, we first have to take a look at the entirety of Tony Ferguson's unbeaten run. The man's ability to keep racking up victories and make his way up to the top was simply legendary. And for all of that to come crashing down ends up being really anticlimactic, as we all expected the ultimate showdown between Khabib and Tony to go down. And for many, the possibility of never getting the fight between Khabib and Tony seems to be an unsettling outcome. For years it has been the fight UFC tried to make, and for now it seems to be the furthest away that it has ever been. And with Tony Ferguson hitting the age of 36, one must ask the question when it will be time for Tony to hang it all up. So join me today as we take a closer look at the final chapter of Tony Ferguson's career. I believe that we can all comfortably say that the highlight of Tony Ferguson's career was when he defeated Kevin Lee for the UFC interim lightweight title. He had the chance to replicate that success going into his fight with Justin Gaethje. Unfortunately, many people who expected Tony Ferguson to be able to take advantage of the quick turnaround Gaethje, as he had not been in training camp as long as Tony Ferguson had been. And because of this, Tony was a clear favorite going into this fight. But at this level of MMA, especially in the UFC, the top 3 of the division can easily always defeat one another. And that statement is very true when you hold it on to the lightweight division. We have the ultimate grappler in Khabib, the skilled yet crazy Tony Ferguson, the tank-like Justin Gaethje, and the accurate, aggressive Conor McGregor. And all the other contenders in the division who are close to being at the top can all easily break into that spot. So with that said, it is never going to be an easy fight for any of these fighters. And when it is, it just comes to show how great in particular that one fighter is. So when you take a look at Tony Ferguson's entire run, beating former champions like Anthony Pettis and Rafael Dos Anjos, it only solidified how good Tony Ferguson actually was. And right now after his defeat, there are many people who seem to be turning his back on him and calling him overrated. I believe that is the most disrespectful thing one can say about a fighter, especially a fighter who is at the top of his division. A fighter like Justin Gaethje has always had my respect. He knew that he could easily have used his wrestling to dominate the majority of his opponents, yet he decided to give the fans a real show and turn his entire game around and become the human highlight reel machine. Though Justin Gaethje really played into this nickname at the start of his UFC career, he since, after losing to Eddie Alvarez and Dustin Poirier, turned his entire fighting style around and became the patient Justin Gaethje that we all know of today. And that version of Gaethje has always had a serious chance of winning going into this fight. When taking a look at who Justin Gaethje is, he is a fighter with a great wrestling background. He is a fighter who stands his ground, comes forward, breaks down his opponent's legs, makes it always a brawl, and having great power in his hands, he can always change things around in an instant. So going into a fight with Tony Ferguson, who was a very active fighter, I knew that the first couple of rounds would be the deciding factors going into the later stages. Tony Ferguson is a fighter who rolls with his momentum, and that momentum gains him success. If there is no momentum, there is no success that can be found. He's similar to Max Holloway in that sense, and one great similarity that you can draw from the Justin Gaethje versus Tony Ferguson fight is the fight between Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway. In the fight with Dustin and Max was the fighter who always had to kind of warm up to his punches, find his range, and then he would get into the fight, and then he would start dominating. Similar to what Tony Ferguson is all about. But facing a bigger fighter and a stronger fighter compared to his featherweight counterparts, Dustin Poirier was a very strong fighter who was always able to hit Max Holloway, hurt him, and then instantly reset him. And because of this reset, he could never gain momentum that he could use against Dustin Poirier. And with that, we kind of have Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje. Justin, going into this fight, didn't have the full training camp Tony Ferguson had. So this made Tony the better conditioned fighter going into this fight. And targeting the body, draining Justin Justin Gaethje even further would have been a priority for Tony Ferguson. And as it was, in the fight, when the two came face to face and started to square off, you could immediately see all the work that Tony Ferguson put into the body. And by the end of the round, you can clearly visibly see Justin Gaethje taking in big breaths. But in that first round, Justin Gaethje was not accustomed to the range yet. Being the fighter with the 6.5-inch reach advantage, he was able to utilize it. But as the fight continued and Justin Gaethje found his range and was able to reset every single time Tony Ferguson tried to gain momentum and then chop down his legs, he was not only able to neutralize Tony Ferguson but also take away one of his tools, which was his long-ranged kicks. And with that, he also immediately eliminated the chances of Tony Ferguson having close quarter contact with Justin Gaethje, as he was always able to get him in the pocket. And this resulted with another tool taken away from him: the elbows. And with the elbows taken away and the long-range kicks, Tony Ferguson had to rely on straight punches from the outside. But Tony Ferguson was never a power puncher to begin with, and against a fighter who was as physically strong as Justin Gaethje, rocking him and hurting him was going to be a very big task, up until the end of the second round, where he was able to catch him with a beautiful uppercut. But after that, Gaethje made the right adjustments and came back as the smarter fighter. Knowing that he doesn't have the same cardio and the same output as Tony Ferguson, he had to stop Tony Ferguson from fighting his fight. And so by kicking his legs and breaking that down, he had to force Tony Ferguson to fight Gaethje's fight. And with that, cardio became no issue. He could pace himself, he could time himself, and with every 10 punches that Tony would throw, it only would need 2 or 3 big Justin Gaethje punches to overpower it. And because of that, we saw what we saw, which was very similar to the Dustin Poirier vs Max Holloway fight. And we really have to commend Justin Gaethje for fighting the fight that he did. It would have been very easy for him to get knocked out in the third round if he didn't get his mind together. But he showed that he is a new version of himself, calmer, smarter, and more effective. And that was exactly what he needed going into this fight, and it was something that I did not expect he could pull off. Though I knew that he could have great advantages by kicking the legs, I did not realize how effective he would be. And effective he was, as he was able to finish Tony Ferguson. Finishing Tony Ferguson alone is something that nobody really expected, and the way that he pulled it off was simply outstanding. But for every win, there is a defeat. And for Tony Ferguson, this defeat is very serious. You see, there is just only so many punches a fighter can take before their body gives out. And you never, ever want to be in a position where you see a fighter just get completely detached from who he was going into the fight. For Tony Ferguson, though however tough he was in that night, it would have been better for him to just get knocked out immediately and save himself all those blows that he took to the head. Because all those shots that he took from Justin Gaethje made me legitimately cringe at every big blow he landed. And it wasn't just a regular blow, these are just dynamites that Justin Gaethje throws. And though Tony Ferguson is tough, sometimes you are too tough for your own good, because nobody can keep on taking these punches and come out the same.
Everybody thinks this is a tough man sport. This is not a tough man, this is a thinking man sport. A tough man is going to get hurt real bad in this sport.
We have seen fighters like Rory McDonald, who were very young, go into these brutal fights and come out a changed man. The body getting weaker, deteriorating faster, aging quicker. These are all symptoms that these brutal fights can have a toll on your body with. And for me, though we all love this sport, we should all love the fighters even more, and love is only what they deserve, because going out there in an empty arena when everything is uncertain and for them to put on a show, that just shows character, and you can only respect that. And the fighter in Tony Ferguson, I'm sure of it, does not want to go out like this. But the real question is, how much damage did this fight do to him, and how much more can he control on the way he goes out? Tony Ferguson, given the fact that he had this long training camp, he had all this time to prepare his body for really brutal fights. And I believe this did him a great favor, as a fight like that would really drain a person. Tony Ferguson, the freak of nature that he is, seems to be in good spirits, and that is wonderful to see. But the injuries he sustained, from the cuts to the broken orbital bones to the cut shins, it is going to be taking a serious while for Tony Ferguson to come back to action. And if or when he does, who would he really fight? Because the entire division right now, or I should say the top 2 or 3, are looking to get an immediate title fight with Khabib, or just fight for the undisputed crown. And so when Tony Ferguson returns, I doubt that he will be fighting somebody like Conor McGregor or get to rematch Justin Gaethje. I believe when he comes back, it will be Tony Ferguson and Dustin Poirier who will be going at it. And that is a brilliant fight. And for right now, the ultimate end to Tony Ferguson's career cannot come until he fights Khabib Nurmagomedov. I'm sure that both Khabib and Tony feel the same way about it. But if Tony Ferguson comes back and loses once again, then can he really ever get another crack at the world title? Assuming by that time, Khabib Nurmagomedov is still obviously the world champion. I'm not too sure of it, but neither am I so sure that for all this time, Khabib will remain the world champion. Because in the end, this is the highest level of lightweight MMA you can get. And Justin Gaethje is a very hard fight for Khabib. And let us say that Justin Gaethje upsets the fight world one more time and defeats Khabib, then maybe we can get the fight that we all wanted. But by that point, would it be the fight that we needed? You see, the only real reason why I wanted to see Khabib and Tony go at it was because we had two undefeated, truly dominant fighters going at it. Not only that, we had an undefeated world champion of 28 fights, 11 win streak in the lightweight division versus a 12 win streak at the lightweight division in Tony Ferguson. But right now, that win streak is broken. What is left of it? Though Tony Ferguson has that unbeaten streak broken, we still have the stylistic matchup that we all wanted to see from the get-go anyway. Because that win streak embodied one thing, their dominance in the sport. And one thing that we all really wanted to know was how dominant they could be against one another. And that was the real main reason for it all to really happen. But right now, after 5 fight cancellations, will it all even happen? And if it does, will Tony Ferguson even be the same? Because one thing immediately came to my mind when the fight was over was when Khabib Nurmagomedov called out Tony Ferguson on his age. He said that, okay, look, if I beat him now, it won't be as good as it would have been years before, because now people will say that Tony Ferguson has gotten old, that he is not the same fighter.
And only one thing make me sad, like this guy become a little bit old. Only this one, you know, he 36, 37 years old. When I beat him, people gonna talk about like, oh, he's old.
Khabib is kind of right when he said that the real prime for a fighter was around 29 to 31 or 2, assuming that the fighter hasn't taken much damage and he went into the sport in prime and top form to begin with. But Tony Ferguson, after that performance, after that beatdown, it is really hard to envision him coming back as a better version of himself. Physically, I doubt it. Mentally, yes, he will be as sharp as he has ever been. But will we ever get that fight? Well, as I always like to say, only time will tell. For now, I believe that Tony Ferguson is going to be a fighter who is eager to come back. And if he does, I will be fairly certain that he will be going right back at the top of the division and claim undisputed UFC gold. Up until then, we will have to wait it out. And as always, I have been Keenan from Keenan KTV, signing off. Later.